Okay, we're going to get started here. So students on this paper, I think, are going to sit up here, right?
Yeah.
And then Howard and I are going to sit in the audience. And then, of course, we have Margot Kaminski, who is WeRobot. I was going to say alum, but veteran, I think, is the right word. And Margot, I think Margot's one of the people that has just been real thoughtful from real early on in this space, writing about drones and increasingly about robots more generally. She's got a couple of awesome draft papers in the works that I've seen one of and can't wait to see the other, and has been teaching robotics law and policy first at Yale. And I don't know if you actually teach it at OSU, do you?
I'm going to roll it into my cyber law class next
Okay,
year.
cool. Yeah. Good call. And so she is a law professor at OSU, which, like UW, has a fantastic programs across the boards. And she's been doing really interesting stuff, collaborating across departments at Ohio State. So this paper, I'm an author on the paper, and you can see the description of it. But I'm going to let you take it from there. So we're going to go to 10 after, and then we'll have lunch. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Margot.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. So before I start, I'm going to just say two things. One, I will not be live tweeting this panel. So anybody who wants to take that on, please do. And two, I wanted to let everybody who's up here introduce themselves because of the number of people on this panel. So before I start,
I'm Herron Alva. I'm a third-year law student here at the University of Washington School of Law, and also just finished my master's from the Information School, also here at UW, on a NSF Cyber Core Scholarship.
Hi, I'm Tamara Bonaci. I'm a finishing PhD student here at the University of Washington, Department of Electrical Engineering. I'm hoping to graduate by summer, and then I'll see where I go from there. Thanks.
I'm Jeffrey Herron. I'm a third-year electrical engineering PhD student here at the University of Washington. Both Tamara and I kind of have some experience in the teleoperation security side for robotic surgery, which is how we got involved in this paper, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it.
Yeah, so that gives some context for my initial caveat, which is that this is a very interdisciplinary paper, and I am only a pseudo-interdisciplinary person. So I will not do justice to a lot of the technical aspects of it, and I really encourage people in the audience who understand those technical aspects to ask questions about them. So I'm going to start with a summary of the paper, but I also want to sort of let you guys know my summary is gently nudging towards a reorganization of the paper,
Right.
But only you will know that, and everybody else who read the paper. All right, this paper is called I Did It My Way, on Law and Operator Signatures for Teleoperated Robots. Basically, it proposes the creation of what the authors call an operator signature. And when they say operator signature, they mean an operator in the surgical sense. I did not know if that was intentional, or if you meant for this to apply to all operators of robots, period. So the specific contemplated use case is teleoperated robotic surgery, where a human doctor will remotely control a robot to conduct surgery through a communications network. And this is distinct a little bit from the conversation yesterday about the paper about telepresence, because this is not solely about a person being in a space that they are not in via robot. It's about a person actually acting on others in a space they're not in. So they start by observing that there are real social benefits to teleoperated robotic surgery. It allows people to conduct surgery in battlefields, in isolated regions, and in disaster zones. But there are a number of possible harms that can arise. They identify three types of failure in teleoperated surgery. First, the robot itself might fail, so you might have a malfunction of the actual machine. Second, the operator might make a mistake, causing the robot to do something that it shouldn't do. And third, and this is sort of the part that interests me the most, the communication link between the operator in the human sense and the operator in the robotic sense might fail or be intentionally compromised by hackers. So they ask, as the opening of their proposal, how do you mitigate against these different types of failures? And relatedly, in order to mitigate against these different types of failures, how do you figure out which one of them actually happened after the failure happens? So the proposal, I will say in as uncontroversial terms as possible, is spy on the operator. Slightly greater detail for the setup of the various problems they're talking about. So we start with this idea that most people can agree that robotic surgery has social benefits, like significant social benefits. And there are the following hurdles in place to adoption of teleoperated robotic surgery. First, there's legal uncertainty. So you have an enormous number of potential cases that could be brought against people for the failure of teleoperated robots. Herron, I presume, was very much involved in the listing of those possible cases. They include potential legal actions for product liability, malfunction liability, negligence, breach of warranty, misrepresentation, medical malpractice. And one I thought was particularly interesting, which has actually been brought, was suing a manufacturer for a robot's failure where it forced a surgeon to resort to non-robotic operation techniques. So basically saying your robot didn't work well enough, and so we're going to penalize you because then the surgeon failed. So there's not yet a consistent legal response to issues that are brought up by teleoperated robots in the surgery context, and this poses enormous costs and hurdles to their implementation. Second concern, not a legal concern, more of a policy concern, is over the insufficiency of training for people who are performing these surgeries. Manufacturers and hospitals have been sued for failing to train people who use robots. And I think it was ECRI Institute report said that robotic surgery is a threat on the top 10 list of health threats, in part because of complications due to insufficient training. And then the third big hurdle to the adoption of these things are cybersecurity concerns. Right, so concerns that there are insufficient protections for medical devices from hacking in these circumstances. All right, so getting a little bit into the proposed solution, which is far more complex than just saying spy on the operator. They start with this idea that each individual human doctor is going to have, and it's based on some evidence, is going to have a unique operator signature, meaning that they will apply tools in specific ways unique to them. They'll apply force in ways that are unique to them. It'll be basically like the doctor-surgeon's handwriting in terms of how they perform surgery through a robot. So they believe, based on other people's research, that this handwriting will actually be unique to each doctor who performs a robotic surgery. There will be some variations on that signature based on actual factors on the ground of a particular operation, such as how overweight a patient is, what other medical concerns a patient has, et cetera. But, and I want you guys to talk about this more, they believe that they can nail this down to something that's unique to an individual person. So then they say, if you generate this signature on the operator side, so that you can identify how a doctor is operating and who the doctor is, you can allow for the following activities. It'll be possible to identify the operator in any given case. So you can say, all right, this definitely was the doctor who performed this surgery. You can authenticate the operator, which gets really interesting. So you can guarantee that during an actual surgery, the right doctor is performing it. And you can perform real-time monitoring during the surgery to both evaluate how well the procedure is going, so that goes to insufficient training, and detect any anomalous activity. So if you know that the doctor behaves in a certain way and the robot is not reacting in a certain way, you may be able to flag cybersecurity problems. With respect to training and operation concerns, this monitoring or through creation of an operator signature may help figure out sufficient training programs, right? Because if you find your ideal doctor operators and you figure out what their signature looks like, you could actually develop programs that would train doctors to behave more like the ideal operators. It could also help clarify legal liability. So this should be very familiar to all of us who have been talking about the role of monitoring and determining responsibility in the legal sphere. Creating an operator signature and recording what operations look like could help determine an appropriate standard of care for purposes of medical malpractice actions, and also help people figure out who was actually responsible for the failure, the manufacturer / the robot, the operator, or this third-party cybersecurity hacker. And then finally, again, I think this is the most interesting part, the operator signature could help with the detection of cybersecurity problems. So you could figure out this is not actually performing like the way we thought this doctor would perform, and possibly stop the surgery or otherwise, figure out how to ameliorate the hacking concern. So that's the paper. I was trying to figure out, as many people have been talking about today, what makes this issue particularly roboty. And I think it's roboty in two interesting ways. One, it deals with embodiment. So this issue of how do you mitigate failure in the teleoperated robotics context is about the fact that the harm, if there's failure, is absolutely terribly egregious, right? The patient on the operating table is going to die. So we are primarily concerned with how do you deal with robots in embodiment when the actions could actually kill people. The second, which hasn't come up as much, and again, I think is really interesting, has to do with the role of the communications network in robotics. So this concern that you have this potential extra party on the table, on the operating table, the hacker, is really interesting to me. So I had a number of questions I want to ask you guys and allow you to respond more generally. And I'm going to save some of my questions in case we don't get enough from the floor, which I doubt will happen. The first big question I had is, can you speak a little bit to how actually feasible this is? Right, so convince me that everybody has this unique signature and that the various parameters that change based on what happens in a given operation aren't going to just obscure that unique signature.
I can answer it. So to give a little bit detailed answer to that question, I have to draw from our other line of work where we just had a paper submitted where we're proposing something we call haptic password as a first step towards surgical signatures. And in it, we looked at the positions, the velocities, and the applied forces and torques on the haptic device that the surgeon is using. And we used that to try to identify the surgeon. And in the tasks that we had, and the tasks were writing the word CHAC, writing your own name, and trying to forge someone else's signature, we were able to identify a person doing the task with 100% precision, which is so high for any type of biometric passwords that people, when I'm talking about our results, are kind of, how are you getting these high results? So that's a very convincing and the first proof of concept and the first actual evidence-based or data-based evidence that we have that surgical signatures are indeed possible and we can do that. To go back to your question, we are aware of the fact that for surgical signatures, as we described them, there are several issues that come to and will have an importance here. So the first one being, each surgical procedure is going to be unique. So in order to understand how the surgical signature should look like, we will have to collaborate with our with medical practitioners to learn about the procedures and how the procedure would go in a benign, actual, normal environment. Second, there are definitely going to be variations in patients. For example, a younger female person will definitely require different care than an older, obese female person, for example. Also, during the procedure, inevitably there are going to happen some unexpected things that may have to cause the surgeon to change the course of actions. Taking all of those into account is not going to be easy, but people are already developing mathematical models similar to the one we are trying to apply here in different contexts of reinforcement learning for robotics and learning robots to teaching robots to repeat human actions. So we feel we can draw from that research.
Yeah, I just want to highlight the last thing that you said, which is that the other implication of this, which I did not mention in my summary, is that once you have operator signatures and you can figure out who the good operators are, you could then potentially teach robots to imitate them independently. Well, that risk always sort of exists with this idea, but I don't think even if we are able to build best surgical signatures ever, we will ever be able to replace surgeons. I don't think this technology even aims at that. Excellent. So then the second point, this is not really a specific question, but I want to ask you guys to talk more about the cybersecurity implications of sort of how one would, based on having an operator signature, prevent the kind of jamming or identify the jamming that you were talking about.
I guess, one thing that we actually wished we could have had more time to flesh out in the paper was this idea of I suppose, robotic autonomous actions based on changes in the operator signature. So if throughout a surgery you see a sudden shift or change that might indicate, the robot's behaving completely differently and being used by maybe some malicious person, at that point you have to start defining, okay, as designers, what do we do then, right? And this opens, at that point, it opens up to kind of the floodgates in both legal implications, ethical implications, and whatnot. And we just didn't necessarily have the time in the paper originally to go through that. But do you want to say something?
So to add to Jeffrey's response, I think there's a little piece before Jeffrey's answer. Oh. So the point of surgical signature mainly is to use it as a monitoring tool. Surgical signature as such is, surgical signatures are meant to raise an alarm when some sort of an unexpected or malicious behavior is being detected in the system. Now, that is definitely something we are going to need. But the bigger question, and going to Margot's question, is when we detect an anomaly in the system, what do we do? And this is what makes these teleoperated robots very much different than existing traditional communication systems, where we can simply stop the procedure, reboot the computer, and start from scratch. Here, when you have a patient lying on the table, rebooting the robot and starting from scratch is something you can't necessarily do, and you probably shouldn't. And also expecting that you will have a surgeon or a medical team available at the place of operation that can just jump in and take over isn't something you can necessarily expect. So what we see as the meaningful next step is, and this is where it becomes very interdisciplinary. We need security experts to work with us, but we also need legal experts and roboticists to keep on doing the good work that they have been doing. The proposal that we have is, once you detect the anomaly, robots should be able to move to some sort of a semi-autonomous operating mode, where it's not the robot that is going to finish the procedure, for example, operating on someone's heart or brain, but the robot will find a way to autonomously move to the safest stopping point until something else more safe and secure can be done to save patient's life and to finish the procedure that has been ongoing. And this is where it becomes tricky from the robotics point of view, figuring out how the robot moves to autonomous operating mode. And making these types of teleoperated surgical robots autonomous is a very hard open question, and not one that we think ourselves can answer. So we need the whole community to participate.
All right, so then the question that everybody here knows I'm going to ask. Privacy, right? Which may or may not be why I was put on this panel. So you reference the literature on patient privacy. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I'm going to press a little bit on what this might do to actual operators as well. But I would like to know what that literature on patient privacy says, because it was only sort of referenced in passing in the paper.
So I think that whenever you introduce a third party into what has traditionally been a situation between a surgeon and the surgeon's assistants and a patient, you're going to introduce these third-party concerns. And so the first thing that came to mind for myself is that there are these contractual issues that come into play when you introduce a third party. For example, this is still an open question, and I don't know the answer to this question, but what is the privacy policy with the Da Vinci surgical robotic system as it relates to both the surgeon and also the patient? I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't delved into that question yet, but these are at least that is my first take on the privacy aspects, is you're introducing a third party, and that has a number of implications from the privacy realm. But as to operator signatures themselves, I would argue that the direct monitoring of an operator in a very important healthcare-related potentially life-saving situation is an area where monitoring, I would argue, is warranted over concerns over privacy. Obviously, as long as the kind of post-analysis of whatever is taken from that monitoring is protected appropriately.
Yeah.
So to address the question of operators' privacy.
I was going to ask. I was asking about patient privacy, but I'll get to operators' privacy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So actually, to now pose the question that you want to answer. So my interest on the operator side of things is actually a little bit more complicated, because I think so. You're the surgeon, and you're performing this. Articulating your privacy concerns, I think, is very challenging, especially in the U.S. system where there will be multiple other people observing your performance as a surgeon, and so how private the surgery actually is from the surgeon's perspective is debatable. But I wanted to talk kind of about what you think about the potential implications for surgeons that are known to be the result of privacy harms. So one might be that you end up with surgeons who are a lot more risk averse because they're afraid that, let's see, if I deviate too much from my previous operator signature, I'm going to be in a position where I'm open to medical malpractice. A second sort of known social science observation about surveillance is that it can make people much more anxious. So apart from risk aversion, you end up with a bunch of really nervous doctors. And then, the third question is like extrapolating from that. What kinds of like larger public health concerns do you think might be raised by having operator signatures, or are there none?
Okay, so let's start from the last question. In terms of larger public health consequences of using surgical signatures, I don't think we are aware of any. In terms of looking more intimately at a surgeon, we were aware of, and during our discussion and making of this paper, we stumbled upon quite a few. And we feel that once you introduce surgical signatures as an idea, you definitely have to address privacy of operators as a separate topic, both in a benign scenario where all of a sudden all involved parties actually do have access to the fact that surgeon didn't get a good night rest, or surgeon had one too many coffee, and that's why they did something differently than what they do the usual way, which probably isn't something a surgeon would definitely agree on. They also want to have their own autonomy and be able to do things their own way without having to justify every single move they do. But at the same time, because of the safety criticality of this application, I think we can draw parallels between surgeons using teleoperated robots and pilots, where in an airplane cabin, each and every movement that the pilot is doing, as well as the conversation that is ongoing in the cabin, is being recorded. And there are some proposals now to also add a video feed at the same time. So, and I know there has been a research effort to add a variety of sensors to pilots as well to monitor their blood pressure, eye movement, and so forth. So if pilots as such operating in similar safety critical conditions are willing and okay with agreeing with such intrusion to their privacy, I think having surgical signatures where after a while I believe surgeons would get used to that and wouldn't have to be anxious. It just becomes as a part of their daily routine. I think they would be willing to deal with that. I think benefits are much larger than potential privacy risks, even for them.
And then Howard, did you have a comment too?
Yeah. I was just going to say that it's really a question of what you do with the data during the operation. Collecting this information about the surgical signature is important to detect problems. But it doesn't mean you keep the data after the operation.
Address via data retention.
And the example I would give is that right now medical schools train.
I'm pretty sure they
Pretending in order for eventual medical malpractice lawsuits, if they come up, you have to retain.
But you have to make a decision, because right now the flight recorder is only the last half hour. And it's destroyed if there's no accident. I mean, that's a regulatory and a political and a negotiation decision. And right now in medical schools, there's immense use of computer simulation and tracking what's happening when they're training surgeons. But there's tremendous resistance to surgeons and being evaluated and having a Yelp listing of their performance. So I don't think this is a technical issue. I think this is a...
I will say some of the technical solutions that they are advocating in this piece come precisely from the retention of the data and analysis of the data. Right. So it does actually end up being...
No, but I mean, that's where it's going to be tricky.
Well, I'd also just like to point out, though, that I think a lot of this data that we're talking about retaining would actually in some ways fall under HIPAA because it's going to be often very specific to that patient, right? This is a surgical procedure that happened on a patient. This could then fall within a patient.
If the third party's involved with that, are they a covered entity? Terrible HIPAA mess.
Yeah, it's true. It's a mess.
In that
but
case-
there's already kind of a legal, there's already kind of like some legal precedent for protecting this class of data at the very least, and whether or not that's being done right at this point in time or not is another question. But I think it would probably fall somewhere under that umbrella.
But one general observation about just this question and this discussion is that this is, I think, an appropriate venue to ask the implications of a particular technology that we are proposing in a way that I have not typically seen in the healthcare space or other spaces myself personally. So I think that having a dialogue of what this means in terms of operators and so on, I think is very, very valuable.
Yep. So I wanted to sort of put my I have another thing, but I'm not going to talk about it until I pose questions. As a way of opening this up to questions, I wanted to observe that one of the reasons why this is so interesting is because embodiment is almost always going to push in the liability space towards greater monitoring, right? Like we're talking about a situation where the consequences of embodiment are so high. We've heard this, multiple people have said this. I think Woody was saying this earlier. Ryan has said it in various venues. The consequences of embodiment are physical and measurably harmful and really high. And so people are more likely to want monitoring in order to both trace liability and prevent those harmful consequences. So I just had a flag for suggested reading by somebody who's in the audience. Jack Baglin, who was a student of mine last year, has a piece out in the Yale Journal of Law and Technology about self-driving cars. And his suggestion, and Jack, you can correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, is basically, so he takes the example of like California requires autonomous vehicles to save information around crashes for the 30 seconds leading up to the crash. So that's an example of regulators mandating data retention in order to make liability easier to find. And he says, yes, liability is going to be easier to determine if things are recorded and insurance will be cheaper. But on the other hand, you have all these privacy and autonomy problems. So the suggestion is have a user's legal responsibility for the behavior of the robot vary in response to the degree of freedom or autonomy or privacy that they want, right? So the more privacy protecting option that you choose, the more we will shift liability onto the user as opposed to onto the manufacturer. Now that sounds bizarre, but if you think about it in the converse, the idea is that the more monitoring you have, the more the liability should be shifting onto the manufacturer of the device, because a la Bryant Walker-Smith's comment about proximity-driven liability, the more control the manufacturer or third party should have over the actual accident that happens. So with that, I want to open up to questions.
Questions? While people are queuing up, I'll just also put in a plug for Eugene Volek's paper on the conflict between tort liability and privacy, right? So Eugene has this paper that says, there are lots of times when our fears over tort liability will lead us to more privacy invasive activities, and the example he leads with is a parking lot where someone gets mugged. You're going to want to put a camera on that parking lot, and then suddenly you're invading people's privacy by having a camera in a parking lot, right? And so I think that tension, but also the Bryant Walker-Smith paper that you mentioned.
I really enjoyed this paper because it gave me a lot to think about, but I got a couple of suggestions and comments. I mean, one is, as I think I told a couple of you the other day, it would really help the reader to make a much clearer separation between the value of logging and the value added of what you're proposing on top of logging, because they tend to get muddled between them, and I spent a fair amount of energy trying to sort it out, not quite sure I got it right. The second thing that the paper made me think about, and this is really probably more for the audience than for the authors, is who's writing about failure modes? And we're now at a point where there's enough of this stuff being deployed that the whole issue of failure mode becomes a really big deal. And that was one of the things that the paper really made me realize, is I've got to think a lot more about that, both on the technology side and on the law side. And, the paper made me think of very ugly failure modes, and to some extent seemed almost to be proposing things which only made sense if there was a very robust failure mode, which I doubt exists, in the middle of the surgery. you think it's been hacked or it's decided it's been hacked, so all of a sudden it stops paying attention to what the surgeon says and does something else. Well, if I'm being sliced up, I'm not entirely sure how comfortable I feel with the robot deciding to down tools or whatever it is, because it's got to have something to do. The third thing goes to, because I wasn't entirely clear about how you don't explain much about the math, and I didn't follow up the footnotes. I wasn't clear to what extent the things you're describing work like hashes of behavior, and how they work otherwise, and that might have a lot to do with how I felt about the privacy aspects of it, how much information is being retained, and how much of it is allows you to do a replay attack of some kind, or to have somebody learn to simulate the fist of the surgeon or whoever it was. So just telling me more about that and not make me go find out would be a really helpful thing to do for the reader. And lastly, I want to take really strong exception to footnote 80.
I will admit to that exception.
So, because I think that this is, one thing you've got to realize is that the footnote 80 says, oh, no, this won't cause more litigation. This information won't be helpful to people who want to sue.
Yeah, so do you have responses?
Did you want to address the value of logging versus?
Yeah, I don't mind actually addressing the value of the value add of operator signatures on logging. The problem with logging is that we're logging all this data and we don't know how to interpret it, right? And so the operator signature isn't something that's parallel to logging. It is actually, in fact, an interpretation of the logging, such that we can then figure out through these logs who is doing what and when, and how does that time up with mechanical failures or otherwise. So it's effectively what we're doing is we're taking a lot of the there's these big data approaches these days where you can basically focus through not just a single instance of an operation, because surgeons do the specific procedure dozens of times, like sometimes a year or over the course of their careers, and through both using our hopefully previous history of various operations, and then looking at and taking this history and then informing what the current model is that they should be performing. Is their hand tremor a little bit different? Are they responding to forces differently than normal? Maybe perhaps they're over caffeinated or they're completely fatigued. Basically, it's an interpretation layer on top of logging that we're proposing has this value add of interpreting the surgeon's state throughout these procedures. I think that's kind of.
So question related to that: would it be possible to retain the interpretation layer and consider getting rid of the underlying log?
Yes, and we've been briefly thinking about that idea, but then you do encounter a problem of what if, and it's inevitably going to happen, what if the interpretation is wrong? Then you had all this valuable data, you interpreted it in a specific way, and then you come to court, you actually have to discuss it, and you don't have the data to show how the interpretation was delivered and how did you infer something that made you.
You'd have an expert battle over algorithms, is what would happen.
Right.
Yes.
We're all looking forward to those.
And part of the point too is that data storage these days is so cheap that from an economical point of view, there's not much reason to delete the data other than privacy concerns. So, and that's the question then when this gets to it.
And also, one thing I would add, because of the amount of data that inevitably we'll be logging, again, without this interpretation layer, this is just data that has no meaning to a naked eye, so to speak. So I don't think we're gaining much in terms of privacy by getting rid of that data. If anything,
Agree to disagree. Okay, so I want to, do you guys, we'll just go through this. If anybody ends up coming on that microphone on that side, you're behind these three gentlemen. First person.
So I realized that most of what you're talking about is teleoperated surgery, but it was mentioned a few times, like error correcting based off of what you've learned in the past, or mimicry based off what you learned in the past. I was wondering if you learned anything from this, from studying liability with teleoperated robots, if that helps with liability for once you make it more autonomous or fully autonomous is everything basically thrown out the window. And who should be liable, and what does it say now who should be liable? What does the law say now who should be liable? I guess this is a question for you.
So I would probably refer back to the Brian Walker-Smith's concepts that Margot pointed out. Is there is a big debate on how much liability should the product manufacturer take on versus the operator versus the hospital. Our kind of initial discussions about this paper were actually framing about not so much standards of care and the direct legal benefits of the operator signature, but where do we divide liability between all of the actors that go on in a teleoperated surgical procedure? And those operators can be the operator, the intervening operator. Might it be a hacker? Might it be someone else that for some reason has to take over for whatever reason? The hospital or whatever other covered entity that this surgery is being done on. You could imagine once they get deployed out for humanitarian concerns, maybe even Doctors Without Borders, those types of entities. Then you have the manufacturer, and then also you, to the extent that the manufacturer may be doing the logging or may not be doing the logging, there might be another party in play there. So we don't have answers yet for where the liability should lie, but those are questions that at least I'm interested in exploring in the future. So
I was just wondering if you added more autonomy, whether or not it'd be more on the algorithm designer, I guess, because it's more. Yeah. Thank you.
I would say it would seem so. If the autonomous event is the trigger to the harm, then that suggests that the liability should maybe point more toward the developer of the algorithm. So.
You're changing error at the same time.
Changing your error.
Then it gets really interesting.
So that goes a little bit to the failure modes question of like, once you're in failure mode, what kind of liability scheme do we want to put into place? Because you don't want to disincentivize manufacturers from having a failure mode.
Hey, I'm Corey Kraft, a student at Oregon State. First of all, I thought it was really interesting, so I appreciate your work in this. I have two questions, sort of one for you guys and maybe one for more of the legal scholars in the audience. The first one is kind of a question, kind of a comment. One of the things that I think could be really interesting in terms of tracking, let's say, a surgical operator, being able to not just register their signal, but register all their movements in this practice. Have you thought about sort of the privacy issues, perhaps, that might arise? Let's say in 5 years, they've done thousands of these surgeries over 5 years. What the operator could potentially be putting themselves out of work if we're able to come up with learning from demonstration algorithms that are successful enough to actually reproduce their surgical movements in a few years. And so, how much control or how much should the operator be aware that them being watched in this situation might actually affect their own sort of economic situation in years down the road when we can actually learn enough from their surgical practice to reproduce that autonomously in given situations. So that's one comment, that's a question. The second one would be, how certain do you have to be in the uniqueness of the operator to actually make this system significant? So, if you can only reproduce a signal or say, 60% confidence level that it's user X versus user Y and Z, is that enough to really act in given situations? So,
Yeah, so those are excellent questions. I wanted to add to your first one just an example that took place today in the New York Times. So there's a lot of conversation right now about pilots and whether planes should be automated given the terrible accident that happened. And there is a pilot in today's New York Times who's basically saying, please, please, please stop characterizing this as something that's going to end up being entirely automated, and probably gives rise to resistance to pilot monitoring, as you were talking about.
Exactly, and that's exactly that's why I really appreciate your question. Both for pilots and for surgeons, one thing we want to make clear, not just in terms of reducing the resistance that we might get from them, but simply because we don't believe this technology is ever going to take over and replace surgeons. It's not meant to do that, and I don't think it has that capability. That goes back to the reliability question you asked later. You know, even if we were able to, with 100% reliability, reproduce and replay surgeons' movement in a specific scenario, still, not every procedure is the same, not every patient is the same, and unexpected events will happen. And there we need human expertise to do something that algorithms can't do, because we can't take an account for all corner cases that can arise. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think for these very specialized and disciplines such as pilots and surgeons, we should even be pushing for replacing them.
Can I have a follow-up to that? But the concern is not necessarily that the surgeon will be entirely replaced or the pilot will be entirely replaced. It's that you'll end up with a lower need for really expert surgeons or really expert pilots, and you end up in a co-robotic situation where the human is necessary but far less valuable and less highly trained, and therefore less highly paid.
So this is the case where I'll have to say I agree to disagree with you. I think something exactly opposite is going to happen. In fact, in the lab that the two of us are coming from, we are currently researching ways to automatize parts of surgical procedure on the brain. That said, we're not trying to make autonomous the most complicated part, but the simplest part that is tiring for surgeons and that's wasting their valuable time. So we are totally for a co-robotic situation where robots will be those that are not so valuable. They are the ones that are doing tedious, boring tasks that are not interesting at all. And if robots are doing that, then by all means, we need experts and highly trained surgeons that can do what robots can do, that can do highly specialized procedures that are intricate and that are very hard for any machine to ever do or recreate. And in terms of that, I think we're going to be going, maybe I'm optimistic and I agree to be seen as that, but I think we'll be going in the opposite directions, where we'll need more specialized and trained and skilled surgeons.
Yeah, there's been some conversations, I'm not going to keep interrupting you, it's my last one. There's been some conversation about there's still, that's really interesting, there's still a potential impact on labor markets that gets really complex, because if you move in that direction and you have only the most highly trained, most specialized humans are the ones that are necessary, then you save the tenured professors at Harvard and you kill all the TAs. Right?
Okay, but how do you get new tenured professors when some of them decide to retire?
Right now, the system is that they do what the robots are going to be doing. So it's that the consequences for labor and for training to replace specialized labor, I think, are really interesting. Yeah. Right, back to the actual questioner.
Yeah, and I think, we're thinking about a surgical setting where maybe perhaps due just to the legal constraints and risks involved that, maybe you wouldn't want to employ a learning from demonstration algorithm, but what about all the other sectors where maybe the risk and the constraints aren't so heavy to where you might be okay with having a teleoperator work for a year or two, and then all of a sudden he doesn't realize he put himself out of a job because of the logging. So, but anyways, very interesting. Thanks.
I just think that's, regardless of this interpretation layer, that's something we have to be aware about, in general. I mean, that's just how robotic systems are designed. Are there to learn, and then as machine learning algorithms get more complicated and more sophisticated, that's going to happen. And that's regardless, though. What we're talking about, though, is so that we're talking about a data interpretation layer on top of the logging that can then infer surgeon state, the state of the person through that, by basically kind of examining the data and how they're using the device kind of more in comparison with prior knowledge about that surgeon. Sorry.
But to put my optimistic face forward again, while that may be true, and certainly some of the activities that where we can replace human labor with robot labor will definitely become obsolete. At the same time, having something more sophisticated and having new and emerging technologies becoming more ubiquitous is going to open the need for new type of labor and knowledge that we may not necessarily have today. So something closes, something new opens. I think we'll be fine. I hope.
Hi, Dave Aragon from UW Electrical Engineering. My question is about the third application, the evaluative use of the signature data. If operators were to perceive, rightly or wrongly, that there is a particular target that they should be aiming for so that the evaluative feedback on them is improving, high and rising is what they would always be going for. Do you see a possibility that that would cause their behavior to converge, possibly at the expense of the ID and authentication, which depend on large differences between good performing surgeons?
Awesome
You see what I mean?
I'm not actually sure if this made it into the paper, but I think often when we're talking about the evaluative properties of the signature, since there's so much of the signature that can potentially change operation to operation, patient to patient, and then we're trying to identify kind of what these overarching themes are for this surgeon. Often I think what we're looking for when we were discussing evaluative measures was in fact, it's kind of more trying to figure out how consistent is. So when a surgeon's being trained, oftentimes they're using the robot to do some teleoperated tasks, not even with a patient, but or maybe with a cadaver or something like that. How consistent are they? Are they jittering a lot because they're nervous? Are they, are they able to perform their sutures consistently with regular spacing? So the thing is, it's sometimes less about, oh, you took more time, or so the thing is, because evaluating a surgery on a specific person is actually really hard, right? That's why anytime there's these malpractice lawsuits, you have to get in a dozen various surgeons and other things to basically evaluate it, and it's difficult.
But do you think it would be a short step from being evaluated on, whether I as a resident did this surgery consistently the last few times, to saying that what I really ought to be aiming for is doing it the same way my attending has done it the last few times, because they're really good. And that doctors would become more similar to each other because of that feedback, right?
That's how it works already.
To answer your question, and thank you, I think in addition to privacy, that's the biggest hesitation in terms of surgical signatures for me personally. But that said, the existing research around surgical signatures and around training of surgeons both in regular normal setting and in teleoperated setting already shows that based on the way people are performing a procedure, you can identify which medical school are they coming from. So yes, we already have this effect that you're talking about. But that effect being there, the way people do and interact with a haptic device, not just in a surgical setting, but in general, is very unique. And because of the sensor streams that we are collecting, which may not be interpretable by a person just looking at what their attending is doing, I don't think we will ever encounter that problem. The difference is when you start looking at the data and the numbers are so significantly different that you can't copy your attending. We saw that very clearly with forging of someone's signature in our haptic passwords. Even when we took two signatures, the original one and the forged one, that look exactly the same. When you look at the data behind it in terms of position and velocity and all the other things, it's clearly different. And you see that this is a signature written by the person who should have wrote it, and this is someone trying to forge it, and you just simply can't hide it. So I don't think we will necessarily have that problem.
So that I think this follows up a little bit on Michael's question about sort of the problem of somebody simulating a signature, right? So it seems like the concern there wouldn't be, general simulation of a surgeon's unique signature because that's too hard to fake. The concern would then be about security of the data retention of the logs, because if somebody is able to either intercept or, in some way break into the logs, then you have a situation where they could very accurately fake being somebody.
Right, and we didn't get to address the question about replay attacks the first time we got it. Replay attacks is something that people do ask about. So one thing that I think works in our favor well, there are two things that work most in our favor. First, doing a replay attack in real time is going to be very hard, and that's mostly because of the human component in the system, and here I think because of the surgeon. Inevitably, and we saw that through our experiments, teleoperation security experiments, when you start doing something that seems very subtle, such as delaying messages going from a surgeon to a robot by some small amount, teleoperators tend to notice that. And they are able to adapt, but they do notice that. And sometimes they don't even know what are they noticing, but they see something is going on. So trying to replay their actions probably wouldn't be a feasible way of doing that. At the same time, being able to collect data, I see this monitoring system and surgical signature as a trusted component of this system, where access to the original data will have to be strictly monitored on itself, and we will have to make sure that a hacker now doesn't have an access to that. And it's a hard security question, but one that we can address, I think.
It's like Russian dolls of security question.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think it becomes a balancing act. It becomes an act between, do we want to have the ability to not just understand what happens during surgery, but do we want to have the ability to of all the other benefits that operator signatures may provide, such as the training aspects. So as well as there's a whole side of the medical field around evidence-based medicine and having the ability for a doctor to go back and learn what mistakes were made in previous surgeries, have the ability to kind of understand what happened beforehand and how to change that. So there's a lot of benefits that this can provide, but it is a series of trade-offs. It does mean that you have an additional body of logs that just as anything can be hacked, exploited, manipulated, so on and so forth. So I see it as a balancing act, and for policy reasons for improving healthcare, I see it as something that is beneficial, but there's always a trade-off.
So I think we have the world's first robot psychiatrist has a question for you.
Actually, believe it or not, I'm wearing a hat in which I actually get paid a little bit as the co-founder and managing editor of the International Journal of Medical Robotics and Computer-Assisted Surgery, published by Wiley. And I think this is such an important paper that I'd like to encourage you to do this, have these conversations at, say, an annual meeting, say the Society of Robotic Surgery, in which you have, like here, an interdisciplinary audience, such as robot manufacturers. You have surgeons of all disciplines. You have hospitals. Hopefully they have some lawyers with them too, but I think it's very important even to remotely do this via InTouch Health if you can't do it in person. And I think these issues are very critical for these audiences at these meetings to hear and to participate and to think about and to further discuss.
Thank you.
I had one thing I want to throw out there, which might galvanize other questions, maybe not. So it really struck me in reading this paper and also sort of rereading things about safety monitoring and self-driving cars, that something people need to be thinking about for future WeRobots. In addition to the taxonomy of how we handle anthropomorphism, I think we need a taxonomy for how we handle harm versus privacy. As Aaron has repeatedly been saying, this is one of those situations where, like, clearly the harm trumps. I mean, if there were any sort of quintessential place where, the harm is life or death, it would be this. And so I'd be curious from you guys, it's maybe not fair to put you on the spot, but how far do you envision operator in the non-surgical sense signatures extending? Like, where is your line to where that balance of this harm is so worth preventing that privacy violations are okay? Where does that line happen?
That's a fascinating question.
Please come up with a taxonomy in the next 4 minutes.
Can we get back to you in 3?
I think there are some examples that are already out there that we've kind of alluded to, such as with pilots, and where the potential for harm, as we've seen in the last few weeks, it can be potentially very high at a cost to many lives. But I'll have to stop there.
Well, I guess one of the things that I think it's important to keep track of is who are we monitoring? I think both in the case, and the reason why we keep on coming back to the airline pilot is because both airline pilots and medical physicians are kind of in a place of privilege, right? There's things your doctor cannot say to you, like they cannot lie to you about. They're held up to a much higher standard than average Joe on the street playing around with a teleoperated robot, right? And so the thing is, I think when we have people in these privileged positions, that's when I think we have to really look carefully at how, basically this kind of this balance. But I think I think we have to bring into that discussion, the taxonomy, the privileges of the operator by society, right? What standard are they held up to, right? And maybe, and this I think then actually, I think the area that I would propose that this then nicely leads into is actually governmental and policing robots, right? Because police are also in a place of privilege in our society, as in, they can wander around and carry lethal force.
The privilege is not based on expertise then, or like licensing around expertise, which is where I thought you were going with this.
Well,
the privilege is like
in some
somebody who can
in
kill
some ways,
someone.
in some ways, I mean, the thing is to be a police officer is to have, in some way, shape, or form, a license from the state, right? So in similar ways that you have a medical professional having to go through med school, go to residency, have a long-standing case. I mean, the thing is, so it's not just whether or not, because anyone can kill someone, right? So the thing is, it's not about that. It's what license or privilege the state and society gives them.
The title of this paper is clearly going to be "License to Kill," by the way. Just happen.
No, I like that actually.
Hey Jeff, if I can jump in, I think also there's the issue of how life critical is it. So if this is a telerobot working in a nuclear power plant with terrible outcomes if a mistake is made, then I'd be really tolerant in monitoring and learning from that data. On the other hand, if it's sweeping a street, at night, I really don't care. So I think part of this is a sliding scale. Along with your privilege position access, there's also how much damage is done if the system is compromised, and that would have to be considered. And that's why both the medical example and the aircraft one, both pop up immediately, because there's, clearly large visible damage that can happen. And that then goes back to the folks that are worrying about stopping killer robots, where if there's humans and robots involved, I think these same problems then come up.
I don't personally hold out much hope that it would be limited to just these situations, because if you look at the history of drug testing, that makes sense for pilots and train operators and people who hold hundreds of people's lives in their hands. But you see it applied to journalists, and the journalists don't even complain now. And I find that absolutely astounding. I mean, you couldn't do that in Britain, that's for sure.
Journalists or drug
Yeah, my comment was going to be along those lines as well. Because of the emerging nature of this technology, if this surgical and operator signature idea gets adopted very quickly, then to some extent, maybe people won't really have a choice, regardless of the privilege and the safety criticality. If that's just something that we do, then we do that. And that also may be okay as long as people are aware of the data that is being logged about them and how that data can be interpreted and used to their benefit and against them. So
I guess then my just one point is that going off the drug testing example, I think really it just generalizes to how much money's involved, because drug testing is also quite used in sports. So if there's ever a sport that requires teleoperation in some way, shape, or form, teleoperated football, yeah, sure, why not? Where athletes being the teleoperators are being paid millions of dollars for a game, then I'm sure they're going to be having every single little bit of them logged for evaluation later. I think that's just the nature of the beast.
So to summarize, I guess, in the taxonomy, so you have privilege, monetary value, and harm or potential to damage, and those are potential. Privilege. So those are potential starting grounds for kind of where do we branch and where do they interact.
4 minutes.
Yeah,
In 4
4
minutes.
minutes. That was beautiful, guys. Thank you. All right, I'm going to close with Karen's question.
Okay, so I actually just wanted to sort of follow on to this point that was made about drug testing and how that sort of, trickled from sort of these high risk or, we could argue like very acute situations to things like journalists, not to mention, things like benefits recipients and, all kinds of people, where we think there's some risk that we can avoid by, everybody, right? And I think there's another slippery slope here. So certainly from privilege to people who are marginalized or powerless, especially in the labor context, but then also within the labor context, from so it actually gets back to framing, Ryan's point about framing, right? So like there's a big frame around safety, but very often that frame around safety is used to justify systems that are used just to improve operational efficiency or productivity in the workplace. Like this is all of my research is about this, is sort of about how, once you have the system in place, according, which has been rationalized or sometimes put into place via regulatory regime, based on this idea, like, so I study truck drivers, right? And we say, like, we need our public roads to be safe. So it's, imperative on all of us to mandate, how tired truckers are and where they are all the time. But then that technology is used not only to monitor safety, but also to, incentivize them to use less fuel, right? And, to all kinds of things that disempower them economically. And I think as much as we can say, we want this to be something that only applies to people who have some special license or some special privilege in society, like that's a very hard slope to actually regulate. And I think this is one too, right? Because the corporate mandate is certainly to, make this a cost-saving measure as well.
Valid point.
Yeah, so if you guys do you have responses to that?
A valid point.
All right, so please join me in thanking our panelists and enjoy lunch.
I hope you'll tweet that paper or something like that, or I don't know if our librarian's here today because she was. Oh, you are indeed. Okay, maybe you'll find it. Thanks everybody. This has been absolutely fascinating. So we're going to adjourn until 1:00, and we'll make up a little bit of time that I lost us. So we'll come back at 1:00. There's food outside. If you're a speaker, discussant, student fellow, there's food in 115 set aside. Okay. Thanks a lot.